On the morning of August 4th, 1892, a maid in Fall River, Massachusetts went upstairs to lie down. Her name was Bridget Sullivan. She was 26 years old, and she had been washing the outside windows all morning in the heat. She heard the City Hall bell strike 11, and she looked at her clock. A few minutes later, a voice at the bottom of the stairs called her down. It was Lizzie Borden, the younger of the two daughters. She was 32 years old. Her father, Andrew Borden, was dead on the sitting room sofa. He had come home from his morning walk about half an hour earlier and lain down for a nap. He had not moved. There was no sign that he had ever tried to. When they went to look for Abby Borden, the stepmother, they found her in the upstairs guest room. And when the doctors examined them, they established the fact that turned this into the most argued about crime in American history. Abby Borden had been dead for at least an hour and a half before her husband was killed, which means somebody killed her upstairs and then stayed in or near that house for 90 minutes, waiting for Andrew Borden to come home. It was a small house on a busy street in a city of 74,000 people in broad daylight, with a maid on the property the entire time. 7 days later, the police arrested the dead man's 32-year-old daughter. The following June, she stood trial. The jury took about 90 minutes to acquit her. She then went back to Fall River and lived there for another 34 years in a town that never spoke to her again. Nobody else was ever charged. The case is officially unsolved, and it has been for 134 years. And the reason it is unsolved has less to do with the evidence than with what the court decided the jury was not allowed to hear. Fall River, Massachusetts, August 1892. A father of 70, a stepmother of 64, two grown daughters who had never left home, and one of the wealthiest men in the city who would not put a bathroom in his own house. 12 men acquitted her in 90 minutes, and the single most important thing she ever said about that morning was never read to them. If you are new here, this is Cold Case Redemption. We tell the stories of the victims who waited longest. Everybody knows the rhyme about this case. Almost nobody knows the two people it is about. Andrew and Abby Borden were real, and they were killed in their own house on a Thursday morning. Subscribe and stay with me. We are going to do this properly, starting with who lived in that house. In 1892, Fall River was one of the great cotton towns of the world. Something like 40,000 people in that city worked in the mills or depended on somebody who did. The mill hands lived in company blocks. Most of them were Irish, French-Canadian, or Portuguese, and most of them were poor. The owners lived up on the hill, in houses with turrets and lawns and indoor plumbing. Andrew Jackson Borden was one of the richest men in that city, and he lived down on 2nd Street, number 92. 2nd Street was a narrow wooden house wedged onto a small lot in a commercial district. There was no bathroom, there was no gas lighting in most of it. The family used chamber pots and washed at a sink in the cellar. Andrew Borden was worth somewhere in the region of $300,000 in the money of the time. That is several million today. He owned bank stock, mills, and commercial property all over Fall River. He had made the first of it as an undertaker and a furniture dealer, and he had never once spent money he did not have to. The word people used about him, over and over, was hard. He was 70 years old. His first wife, Sarah, had died in 1863. 3 years later, he married Abby Durfee Gray. She was 37, unmarried, and by all accounts glad of it. She was heavy, quiet, and unambitious. She raised his two daughters from the age of 2 and 12. Emma Borden was 41 in 1892. She had never married. Lizzie Andrew Borden was 32. She had never married either. Lizzie taught Sunday school. She was secretary of the Christian Endeavor Society. She was active in the temperance movement. She was, in the language of the time, a respectable single woman of good family, which in 1892 was a full-time occupation, and she lived in a house where the doors between the bedrooms were kept locked, not the front door, the internal doors. Lizzie's room locked from her side, the parents' room locked from theirs. The connecting doors were bolted on both sides. The two sisters and the stepmother had stopped eating meals together some time before. They took them separately. Ask anybody who has lived in a house like that, and they will tell you what that means. It means a fight that never ended. The fight was about money, and the specific event that everybody in the case pointed to happened 5 years earlier. In 1887, Andrew Borden gave a house to Abby's sister. It was not a large gift by his standards. To his daughters, it was the whole issue, because it was family property going to Abby's family. From that point on, both daughters called their stepmother Mrs. Borden, never mother. And the locks went on. The week of August 1st, 1892, was miserably hot in Fall River. On Tuesday the 2nd, the entire household was violently sick through the night. Andrew, Abby, and Bridget Sullivan. The next morning, Abby Borden walked across the street to Dr. Bowen's house and told him she thought they were being poisoned. Dr. Bowen told her it was the mutton. They had been eating the same joint of meat for several days in August heat, with no refrigeration. He was almost certainly right. In 1892, that is what made people sick. On that same Wednesday, a woman went into Smith's drugstore in Fall River and asked to buy prussic acid. Prussic acid is cyanide. She said she wanted it to clean a sealskin cape. The clerk refused. It was a poison and it required a prescription. He said afterward that the woman was Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden denied it. And here is the first thing you need to hold on to because it decided this case. That testimony was never heard by the trial jury. The judges ruled it inadmissible. On Wednesday evening, an uncle arrived. John Morse, brother of Andrew's first wife, came to stay. He was put in the guest room upstairs. That is the room where Abby Borden would be found the following morning. Emma Borden was not in the house that week. She was visiting friends in Fairhaven, about 15 miles away. So, on Thursday the 4th of August, the people in that house were Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, Bridget Sullivan, and John Morse. Breakfast was mutton, mutton broth, bread, coffee, and bananas. In a house where 3 of them had been sick 2 nights before. John Morse left the house at about 8:45 to visit relatives across town. He would spend the whole morning with them, and his alibi was checked, and it held completely. Andrew Borden left about 9:15 to do his rounds, the bank, the post office, his properties. That left Abby Borden, Lizzie Borden, and Bridget Sullivan in the house. Abby went upstairs to the guest room to change the pillowcases and make the bed after her brother-in-law. Bridget Sullivan was outside, washing the ground floor windows from the yard, and then washing them again from inside. Between about 9 and 10:30 in the morning, Bridget was outside for long stretches. She saw and heard nothing unusual. Somewhere in that window of time, Abby Borden was killed in the guest room. The room is directly at the top of the front stairs. Anybody going up would have seen her from the landing. At about 10:30, Andrew Borden came home. The front door was bolted with 3 separate fastenings, and Bridget Sullivan had to let him in. And as she struggled with the locks, Bridget Sullivan said something under her breath. Then she testified that she heard Lizzie Borden laugh from the top of the stairs. Lizzie Borden denied she was upstairs at all. If Bridget was right, Lizzie was standing a few feet from her stepmother's body. Andrew Borden asked where Abby was. Lizzie said Abby had received a note from someone who was ill and had gone out to visit them. That note was never found. The person who sent it never came forward. Newspapers appealed for the messenger. Nobody answered. Andrew Borden lay down on the sitting room sofa in his shoes to take a nap. Bridget Sullivan went up to her attic room to rest. She heard the city hall bell strike 11. A few minutes later, she heard Lizzie calling. "Come down quick. Father is dead." Lizzie sent her for Dr. Bowen and for a neighbor, Adelaide Churchill. It was Bridget Sullivan and Adelaide Churchill who went upstairs and found Abby Borden, not Lizzie. And within an hour, the Fall River police made the first of a series of decisions that lost this case. Word went round Fall River in minutes. By early afternoon, there was a crowd in the street. It was the 4th of August. Almost the entire Fall River police force was away at their annual picnic. The men who should have secured that house were on a boat. So the house was not sealed. Neighbors came in and out. The undertaker came. Doctors came. The autopsies were performed on the dining room table, in the house, that same day. There was no forensic laboratory to send anything to. There was no fingerprinting in American police work in 1892. On the Saturday 2 days later, police searched the cellar properly and found 4 hatchets and axes. One of them was a hatchet head, with the handle broken off close to the eye, covered in ash. The prosecution said it was the weapon, and the handle had been burned. The defense said it was an old broken tool in a cellar full of old broken tools. No blood was ever established on it in a way the court would accept. It was never tied to the killings. 3 days after the killings, Lizzie Borden burned a dress in the kitchen stove. Emma Borden was there and said she had told her sister to do it because the dress was stained with paint. A family friend named Alice Russell was also there, and she was troubled enough by it to tell the grand jury. Her testimony is what got the indictment. The Borden sisters never spoke to her again. Now the piece that decided everything. On the 9th of August, an inquest was held. Lizzie Borden testified for 3 days. She did not have her lawyer present. She was, by then, already the only suspect. She had also been given morphine by Dr. Bowen for her nerves, and she was still taking it while she gave evidence. Her answers contradicted each other repeatedly. Where she had been, whether she had gone upstairs, whether she was in the barn. Her account was that she had spent about 20 minutes in the hot barn loft, looking for sinkers to go fishing. An officer went into that loft afterward and said the dust on the floor was undisturbed. On August 11th, she was arrested. In December, a grand jury indicted her. And when the trial opened in New Bedford on the 5th of June, 1893, the defense made one motion that won the case. They argued that the inquest testimony was inadmissible because she had effectively been a prisoner without counsel when she gave it. The 3 judges agreed. The inquest testimony was excluded. So was the prussic acid evidence. The 12 men in that jury box never heard her contradict herself. They never heard about the drugstore. Whatever you believe about this case, that is the hinge, not the hatchet, the ruling. Within 2 days, this was a national story, and it stayed one for 11 months. The New York papers sent men. So did Boston, Providence, and Chicago. Fall River had never seen anything like it. And what they printed in those first weeks shaped everything that came afterward, including the jury pool. Papers ran floor plans of the house. They ran drawings of the rooms. They ran diagrams with arrows. For about a year, that narrow wooden house on 2nd Street was the most reproduced building in the United States. And Fall River split. Not quietly. A large part of the Protestant middle class of that city simply refused to believe it. Ministers spoke for her from the pulpit. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union stood behind her. Suffrage campaigners took up her case as a question about how the state treats women. Down in the mill districts, the view was different, and it was blunt. A poor woman would have hanged for this in a week. The Fall River police were caught between those 2 cities, and they made it worse at nearly every step. They searched the house properly 2 days late. They let the crowd in on the first day. They lost the chance at any physical trace there might have been. And when they finally produced a weapon, they produced 4 candidates and could not tie any of them to anything. Lizzie Borden spent 10 months in the jail at Taunton, waiting. She was not held with other prisoners. The sheriff's wife brought her meals. Ministers visited. Flowers were delivered. Letters came from strangers all over the country. Most of them supportive, some of them proposals of marriage. Emma visited constantly. So did the family lawyer. And by the time she walked into the New Bedford courthouse in June of 1893, half of respectable New England had already decided. 12 men were selected from a county where every one of them had been reading about it for 10 months. That on its own would be enough to complicate a modern trial. In 1893, nobody thought it worth mentioning. The trial ran from the 5th to the 20th of June, 1893, before 3 judges of the Massachusetts Superior Court. Reporters came from New York, Boston, Chicago, and further. The wires ran straight out of the building. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton led for the state, with William Moody, who would later sit on the United States Supreme Court. For the defense, Andrew Jennings, the family's own lawyer, and George Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts. 12 men were sworn. Their average age was well over 50. Every one of them was a New England Protestant with property. And the woman they were looking at was a Sunday school teacher in a black dress with a fan. The state's case was entirely circumstantial, and the state admitted it. Nobody saw either killing. Nobody found a weapon that could be tied to them. Nobody found a blood-stained garment. That last point was the state's biggest problem, and it never solved it. Whoever did this was within a few feet of both people. There was no blood on Lizzie Borden and no blood on any clothing found in that house. The state's answer was the 90 minutes and the locked house. The defense's answer was the missing blood. Bridget Sullivan testified. She said nobody came to the door. She said she heard nothing from the house. She also said she had heard Lizzie laugh at the top of the stairs, and that stayed in the record. Then the prosecution made a mistake that people still argue about. They brought in the skulls of the victims as exhibits to demonstrate the wounds. Lizzie Borden fainted in the dock. The jury watched a middle-aged churchwoman collapse in front of them. Whatever the intention, the effect on that jury was the opposite of what the state wanted. George Robinson closed for the defense, and his argument was not really about evidence. It was that women of Lizzie Borden's class and character did not do things like this, and that the state was asking the jury to believe something impossible. One of the judges then delivered a charge to the jury that read, to many reporters in the room, like a closing speech for the defense. The jury went out on the 20th of June. They were back in about 90 minutes, not guilty on every count. Some accounts say they had voted on the first ballot and then sat a while so as not to look hasty. There was cheering in the courtroom and cheering in the street outside. Lizzie and Emma Borden inherited the estate. They bought a large house up on the hill, in the part of town their father had refused to move to. Lizzie began calling herself Lizbeth. She stayed in Fall River for the rest of her life. Her church, where she had taught Sunday school for years, effectively closed to her. Old friends crossed the street. In 1905, after about 13 years in that house together, Emma Borden moved out and never lived with her sister again. She never gave a reason anybody has been able to verify. She died 9 days after Lizzie in 1927. Bridget Sullivan left the city not long after the trial and lived quietly in the West until 1948. Lizzie Borden died on the 1st of June, 1927, age 66, and was buried in the family plot beside her father and her stepmother. Nobody else has ever been charged. The case is officially unsolved. So, what is actually left factually? One theory says the daughter in a house of locked doors and a 5-year argument about property. A jury heard that case without the inquest testimony and rejected it. One theory says the maid. She was never charged, no evidence was ever produced against her, and no motive was ever demonstrated. One theory says an intruder who came in for money and then stayed 90 minutes, which is the part that has never worked. And one theory says somebody in that circle whose name never made it into the record at all. Here is what I keep coming back to. This case did not fail on evidence. It failed on a ruling. And I want to be careful here, because that ruling was almost certainly correct. A woman was questioned for 3 days as the only suspect, without a lawyer, while taking morphine prescribed for shock. No modern court would admit that either. So, the system did what it is built to do, and the result is that 2 people were killed in their own house, and nobody was ever held to account. Andrew Borden was 70. He was hard with his money and hard with his daughters, and he was asleep on his own sofa. Abby Borden was 64. She married a widower with 2 small children and raised them, and for the last 5 years of her life, they called her Mrs. Borden. She died making up a bed for a house guest. And for 134 years, she has been a line in a children's rhyme that gets her relationship, her name, and the number of blows all wrong. This case will never be solved now. Everyone who could have answered it has been dead for the better part of a century. But unsolved is not the same as forgotten, and the 2 people it happened to had names. If this one stayed with you, share it, and tell me in the comments what you make of that ruling. Subscribe to Cold Case Redemption, a new case every week. I will see you in the next one.